Good evening. Welcome everyone to our Explorations in the Medical Humanities series. My name is Arden Hegley. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Society of Fellows and one of the co-organizers of this lecture series, along with my colleagues Carmel Raz, Heidi Hollis, and Ron Lee. The goal of our series, which lasts the whole full semester, is embedded in the title Explorations. Over the course of 7 meetings, we hope to explore some of the myriad approaches to the possibilities of studying the medical arts in the body, health and disease, by bringing in scholars from different institutions to Columbia to discuss their work. We have a lineup of fascinating talks, so do look for our posters around campus and emails and as well announcements on the web. As the medical humanities are so inherently interdisciplinary, we hope to create an interdisciplinary dialogue among colleagues at Columbia on campus. This initiative is generously sponsored by the Society of Fellows, the Human Center for the Humanities, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Center for Science and Society. And tonight's talk is a special event in our series. When we were putting the program together, we hope to be able to invite a speaker whose work bridges medical and environmental approaches to the humanities, and we are so fortunate to be able to feature Andreas Malm. She will be speaking tonight about fire, water, moon, supplemental seasons in a time without season. And for those who are here at last night's talk, there was a great deal of discussion of the 4 elements in traditional Buddhist medicine, so we feature some continuity on an elemental level between the talks. All right, Annelise Francois is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at UC Berkeley. She is the author of the very important and influential book in Romanticism, Open Secrets, The Literature of Uncounted Experience. Her talk today is part of her current book in progress, which is called Provident Improvisers, Parables of Sustenance in the Time of Enclosures. This is a book about gleaning that also takes gleaning for its own critical method. Provident Improvisers puns on the tension between provisions, foresight with regard to necessities like food, providence, trusting to chance, the weather, and so on, and provisional, provided or adopted for the time being, supplying the place of something regular, permanent, or final, accepted or used in default of something better, or tentative. Tracing the contradictory logic of modern capitalism's ways of enclosing nature and stocking reserves, Provident Improvisers looks to alternative ways of living without reserves, in various parables of substance, found in Basho, Rousseau, Wordsworth, Clare, Constable, Thoreau, Benjamin, John Berger, and others. Please welcome Annelise Francois.
Thank you, Arden, and thank you, Tricia, for making this happen. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry I missed last night's talk, and I'm really glad some of you may have heard it, because I think the connections between this talk and the medical humanities are connections you're going to have to tease out for me, and I hope you'll be able to do so. Those of you who know my extended footnotes may appreciate the fact that this paper began, well, the conception for it was to think of it as a series of footnotes to another paper, Ungiving Time, Reading Lyric by the Light of the Anthropocene, which is soon to appear in a volume of essays edited by Tobias Menley and Jesse Oak Taylor called Anthropocene Reading. And in that essay, I draw on scholars such as Andreas Malm, Ted Underwood, and Menley himself, who have conceptualized the Anthropocene as a change in the Earth's relation to the sun that results when fossil fuel economies draw on and release, only to trap again, the stored energies of solar years past. In my talk today, I would like to ask about what has not changed in the Earth's relation to the moon, and about the persistence of multiple secondary seasons that, determined by the moon's fluctuating gravitational pull, remain embedded and continue to make epicircles within the Earth's single rotation around the sun. Just as the moon's light is derivative of and supplemental to the sun's, so what I give you today can be thought of footnotes to this earlier essay, supplementing and extending its argument in aleatory, redundant, and to some extent in essential ways. And that's why it really doesn't matter if you haven't read that essay. I should speak up. Yes?
I'm part of your substantive.
Okay. I'll try to project and slow down.
Thank you.
Okay. A time out of time, in more senses than one, is how Dana Luciano pithily refers to the post-Holocene, a time out of time. In a phrase that captures both the political urgency of having run out of time to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and the existential crisis of having been ejected from the more normal rhythms of diurnal, circadian, and seasonal time. In the nearly 2 decades since atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen first proposed the term Anthropocene for a new geological epoch defined by the impacts of human activity on the Earth's living system, numerous critics have rightly faulted the term for failing to discriminate between types of human activity, for discounting the long history of other kinds of mutual modifications between humans and their habitats, and for inventing a culprit, the human species, for what are in fact historically specific expressions of violence and concentrations of power, historically determinate plantation model modes of production, extraction, and exploitation. Hence the proliferation of alternate terms, the capitalocene, the plantationocene, the Anthropocene, and of alternate datings to the one proposed by Crutzen, 1784, the year of James Watt's invention of the steam engine, for the start of this new era. In their 2015 study published in the journal Nature, climate scientists Simon L. Lewis and Mark A. Maslin proposed 1610, because the date marks both the lowest level in the drop of atmospheric carbon dioxides, attributable, they argue, to the reforestation that followed the deaths of 50 million Amerindians post-European conquest, as well as the point of no return from the homogenization of planetary biota initiated by the same colonial contact. So, in fact, James C. Scott, whose book I've also been reading, Against the Grain, refers to this period as the Little Ice Age that began mid-16th century and ran through the mid-19th century, where the disappearance of cultivating human societies that were keeping the forests at bay meant reforestation, meant a dip in the Earth's temperature. As Luciano argues, by rendering the stratigraphic record interpretable as evidence of genocide, as the inscription of mass murder, Lewis and Maslin enroll climate science among the, quote, numerous cosmologies that hold that the Earth will remember acts of intrahuman violence, that the planet itself will testify to the brutality humans have inflicted upon members of their own species. That's Luciano. I will return in the following pages to this figure of the stratigraphic record as the encryption of human history. For the drop in CO2 levels represents the most minimal, anti-representational of epitaphs, a dip in the line that encrypts in the precise sense of marking without necessarily making legible or breathable the disappearance of human societies. And here I'd like to actually acknowledge a wonderful paper by Vincent Bruyère, which he gave at last year's ACLA, in which he addressed the latent potential for elegy within these stratigraphic maps when we take them as representations of loss. Almost simultaneous to the moment when at the end of the 20th century a number of thinkers were defining late capitalism through the lens of dematerialization, the dematerialization of finance, the intensification of contingency, mobility, groundlessness, temporariness, and liquidity, early 21st century work on the Anthropocene was thus beginning to conceptualize making a difference, not in terms of political revolution, but in terms of non-reversible changes to the physical conditions of the Earth. While these anthropogenic changes will likely spell the end of conditions favorable to life for most humans and other familiar life forms, they also signal what we might call the Earth's monumentalization or encryption, the moment at which it assumes the work once assigned it to culture of archiving human history by becoming the storage house for non-erasable anthropogenic deposits. So in their first chapter of The Shock of the Anthropocene, Christophe Bonneuil and Jean-Baptiste Frezos include among destructive anthropogenic effects, in addition to the warming of the Earth's temperature caused by the burning of fossil fuels and to the loss of biodiversity caused by large-scale industrial agriculture, they also include the modification of the continental water table through damming and irrigation, and the deposit in the planet's ecosystems over the last 150 years of entirely new substances. Synthetic organic chemistry, hydrocarbons, plastics, some of which form a new type of rock. And Dana Luciano has written really wonderfully about what it means to think about the presence of plastic as a change in the Earth's physical conditions. This is all, by the way, this is all prefatory to the argument for the video paper, but anyways, I'll just plow on. As Bonnet and Frezos argue, far from some kind of mastery, the supposed elevation of man or the human to the status of geological actor capable of changing the face of the planet, in fact spells the end to illusions of freedom from nature, and definitively brings to a close a certain narrative of modernity, according to which nature is simply what it is, while the human is defined as the subject who gives itself a history through its transformation of the material world. Pointing to the dissonance between the discourse of dematerialization of capital and labor under late capitalism and the language of inscription structuring discourse about the Anthropocene is just one way of marking this irony. We might, for example, compare Bonnet and Frezos' metaphors of enduring, non-erasable inscriptions, deposits of chemicals described as a typical signature of the Anthropocene in the sediments and fossils in the course of formation, to Zygmunt Bauman's claim in Liquid Modernity that lightness and temporariness now belong to the prerogative of the powerful. Bauman is writing in 2000, and he writes, traveling light rather than holding tightly to things deemed attractive for their reliability and solidity, that is, for their heavy weight, substantiality, and unyielding power of distance. This is now the asset of power. Holding to the ground is not that important if the ground can be reached and abandoned at a whim, in a short note of time or in no time. So this is part of the larger project, but one of the things I'm trying to do is to think together the coincidence in accounts of late capitalism of these opposed figures of lightness and heaviness, of the perdurability and easy undoability of traces, and this heavy form of inscription. And again, there's something moving, and I want to somehow recover the pathos of the way that this discourse of lightness is thinking about, is resonant with a certain earlier aesthetic of the wind, which comes and goes as it pleases. And if you're familiar with Fossil Capital, Andreas Malm's text, he writes quite beautifully about the Heraclitan dimensions of wind and water as forms of energy that are there for the taking, but only when they're there for the taking. So we have, some of these oxymorons could be defined as heavy liquidity, sunken, unfloatable latency, immutable, non-malleable disposability. One needs to tax the imagination with such peculiar figures of thought so as to think together both the enormity of material consequences and their continued defiance of a conventional sort of realism, whereby only the actual or empirically present counts as present. In Ungiving Time, I draw on Barbara Adams' The History of the Future to put the problem this way. If modernity is the story of ever-widening horizons of expectations, the Anthropocene would be the counter-turn, ushering in the time of shrinking horizons, reduced expectations, shortening lifespans, disappearing margins, vanishing spaces of the habitable, the sudden return of a fated, already condemned rather than open, still to be determined future. The name, in other words, for the blockage of the future that results, ironically, from modernity's appropriation of the future as a, quote, abstract, empty, and quantifiable entity, available for free, unrestricted use and exploitation. And there's a passage from Barbara Adams' essay, The History of the Future, on the handout. I deliberately included it because I thought I would skip it in the talk itself. So, yeah, and for the sake of time, you can just refer to her account of the ways in which, part of the after effects of industrial capitalist modernity are latent. So they haven't yet occurred, but in some sense they also have blocked the future. The irony whereby an expansive modernity, by the very violence of its appropriative expansion, has robbed itself of an open or as yet undetermined future, can also be thought through the figure of what Srinivas Aravamudan, in an essay from 2013, called the catachronism of climate change, the inversion of anachronism by which the present under climate change is shadowed by the advance occurrence of a future whose causes lie in the past. This figure of a future blocked in advance by radioactive and carbon half-lives is in turn only the temporal inversion of the release into the present of the deep geological past, represented by coal mining and the burning of fossil fuels. At least, this is how Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital helps us to conceptualize the Anthropocene, and as an ontological break in and a messing up of the Earth's relation to the sun. So Malm is drawing on E.A. Wrigley's differentiation between organic and inorganic energy economies, and Wrigley is distinguishing these economies in terms of their relative dependence on or independence from the yield of present photosynthesis. Simplest way to put this is that where earlier agrarian societies still stood more or less in relation to the annual supply provided by one rotation around the sun, the present of coal and post-coal economies expands to include the, quote, stores of post-photosynthesis. This much I argue in Ungiving Time, an essay in which I ask about what, if anything, changes for human temporality when societies begin availing themselves of millennia of past solar years. In these pages, I would like to turn instead to the moon and to the continued help that might be preferred by these relatively unchanged lunar cycles. But first, just a few more premises establishing some of what I want to push back. Well, I have to establish it before I can push back against it. And just take a moment to remember that we're near Morningside Drive, which was named obviously because of its relationship to the morning. And we're in late September and it's close to 90 degrees. In June of last year, when the Northern Hemisphere jet stream merged with the Southern Hemisphere jet stream, climate scientists called this bad news for seasonality and warned of the extreme weather-generating mixture of seasons. The irony of the resurgence of this seemingly archaic term, seasonality, in the mouths of expert scientists has to do with the origin of contemporary anthropogenic climate change in an economic system built on the homogenization of space and time, on the erasure of seasonal variation, and on the permanent availability of labor, goods, and services. Brilliantly analyzed by Jonathan Crary as an assault on the right to sleep and on the capacity to absent oneself in periods of inoperative and non-serviceable darkness, the logic of 24/7 expresses itself as the possibility of round-the-clock illumination, used as a convenience in homes, a necessity in hospitals, and an instrument of torture in solitary detention. But where does this logic begin? In the extension of daylight used in industrial poultry farms to force hens to lay eggs twice rather than once a day? Or does it already lie latent in the contingent moment in evolutionary history when primates acquire or come to possess the menstrual cycle? A tool or temporal prosthesis freeing sexual reproduction from a specific season in the Earth's solar years. And I'm deliberately citing here Donna Haraway's summary of the claim that primate studies began making in the 1920s. She writes, in the 1920s, primate studies began to claim that all primates differ from other mammals in the nature of their reproductive physiology. Primates possess the menstrual cycle. Why is this not what we learn when we're studying all those moments in which humanism wants to distinguish itself from other animals, right? Humans have language, humans have consciousness, humans have feelings. No one ever says humans possess the menstrual cycle. And I'm pretty sure Haraway must be thinking about that when she thinks of the very thing that is what women who are defined by what they don't have is in fact what they have. And it really is interesting to think of it as a prosthesis, as an early way of extending seasonal time. So this emphasis put on how the menstrual cycle translates to the fantasy-inspiring fact of constant female receptivity. That's also Haraway. This emphasis certainly suggests a continuity in which the logic of 24/7 suggests a continuity with the logic of 24/7, as if the history of a certain kind of modernity were nothing more than the progressive decoupling of reproduction from spring and the intensification of forms of uninterrupted availability. Here it's worth noting that it is not that there is necessarily more reproductive sex or that modes of pleasure intensify or multiply, but simply that the possibility of accessing X becomes constant rather than intermittent. The operative difference generating the illusion of surplus is on the order of potential rather than actual value, something that will be true in all of my examples. And of course, as Anna Baginski, who's a PhD candidate in comparative literature at UC Irvine, she reminded me when she read a draft of this paper, the idea of monthly seasonality appears as constant availability or receptivity only in comparison with a form of seasonality that defines seasons in larger cycles. Since it's not true that menstruating women can conceive every day of the month, and the difference between readiness and non-readiness for procreation isn't something that shows, Baginski went on to ask me, maybe the fantasy of constant receptivity is also an effect of not being able to tell what or when receptivity is. And I think this is really brilliant, and it helps maybe explain the anxiety that may drive the insistence that X always be available. Yet this account of Menzies as prototypical of the independence from seasonal time that will extend the hours of reproductivity late into the nights of industrial capitalism immediately raises several objections. It pays short shrift to the relations, however open and indeterminate, between lunar cycles and cycles of ovulation, and it appears to discount the many different kinds of reproductive seasons, as if prior to menstruating primates, the Earth's rotation around the sun afforded only one spring. In the remaining pages, I'd like to turn to accounts that recover or bear witness to the threading of the seasons into ever more discrete, determinate, and delicate units of time, the temporal equivalent to what people in the Bay Area call microclimates. My examples are deliberately chosen from radically different traditions, with little in common except their foreignness to modern clock time and their ability to serve as a counterexample to the catachronic relation to the sun resulting from the ability to access its accumulated energies and store them again as potential that goes by the name of the Anthropocene. While only the last example is strictly literary, and only it makes explicit the question of the relation between poetic rhythm and lunar time, all three examples reflect the importance given in pre-colonial and pre-enclosure modes of knowing to phrenology as the field of science concerned with cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena. This importance is self-explanatory, given that it is a science impossible to practice without long-term familiarity with the particular locale and its weather patterns. The reader impatient for the moon and for the questions of lunar seasonality will have to await this last example, the other two being only conceptually related in their attention to complex but relatively regular modulations in patterns of waxing and waning energy. So my first example challenges the zero-sum game according to which the relative dominance of plants can only indicate the relative absence of humans, and vice versa, implied when Lewis and Maslin interpret the stratigraphic drop in CO2 levels as indicative of the reforestation that followed the genocide for Amerindians. The evidence offered in M. Cat Anderson's Tending the Wild, Native American Knowledge in the Management of California's Resources, to some extent confirms Lewis and Maslin's hypothesis. Prairies and meadows did give way to denser forests following the killing and forced removal of Californian Indians. But attention to Anderson's argument would also remind us that indigenous peoples were not simply swallowed by the forests that took their place, but that their relation to the ecological climax community was one of continued and reiterated delay and deferral, rather than simple opposition and negation. According to Anderson, the extraordinary diversity of and the micro differences found among California's wildflowers can be read as an expression and hence a persistence or survivance of disappeared Californian Indian practices, even if these practices themselves have for the most part fallen away. And here follows a quotation that's on the handout, and again, for those of you who may not be familiar with the definition of what a climax community is, and in evolutionary terms, I kind of stole it from Wikipedia. So this is Anderson. Many of the biologically richest of California's habitats were not climax communities at the time Euro-Americans arrived, but instead were a rich mosaic of ecological succession, or fire subclimaxes, intensified and perpetuated by seasonally scheduled burning. Heightened species diversity, abundance, and density have been associated with regular intermediate intensity, spatially heterogeneous disturbance. Based on this relationship, it can be hypothesized that the disturbance by California Indians' use of fire in a variety of ecosystems occurring at intermediate intensities and frequencies promoted a maximally heterogeneous mosaic of vegetation types and increased species diversity. Anderson invites us to read the work of Californian Indians in the pockets of wildflowers that remain, like outcroppings in the absence of the regularly timed disturbances that allowed them to take hold in the first place. The flowers we find today may be living beings, but they are also graveyards, museums, ruins, traces, forensic evidence of mass murder, as well as auto-representations of the pollinating practices that dilated time and that delayed the onset of climax communities. Discernible in the evidence through which Anderson sifts, in the oral narratives of survivors, as well as in the notes of European naturalists, is a formalization of time comparable to that of shepherds' calendars or farmers' almanacs. The sense that emerges is the organization of time into distinct intervals of off and on, overlapping cycles that extend sometimes 2 years or 3 or 5, seasons not partitioned according to the Earth's position relative to the sun, nor concluded within a single rotation around the sun, yet still in some kind of determinate relation to the work of photosynthesis performed within that period. And here again, I've included more passages than I have time to read, and I encourage you to read them on your own, because I think it's partly because this is elegiac work that's testifying to something that is for the most part disappeared. It's only through, I think, multiple excerpts that you can get a sense of what would have been a knowledge of extensive circular and repeatable time. So maybe just from the second, right, there were many more specific rules in California, such as take roots from one side of the tree only. When digging ponderosa pine roots for baskets, the Maidu cut roots from one side of the tree 1 year and from the opposite side the next year, so as not to kill the tree. Anderson is inviting us to think about fire seasonality in a much richer and complex way than the way that we now think about it, which is simply that the fire season is when it's dry enough that there's fire danger. To manage here means to divert and fray what we now more or less ignorantly refer to as the single annual fire season by diversifying it into multiple seasons for different kinds of fire. In remembering that the frequent setting of such low-level fires would have prevented the kind of far more lethal top-crown forest fires so destructive to California's forests in recent years, there is cause to grieve in the way national forest policy continues to misrecognize this ecology. But there's also a chance to recover a seasonality that was less about living in accord with set periods of solar proximity and distance than of alternatively accentuating, minimizing, and pluralizing these fluctuations, disturbing and distributing their energies across time, and thereby deferring an otherwise violently destructive punctual event. In the same way, in protracting and extending the open spaces for wildflowers, thereby deferring the onset of what 20th century ecologists would call the forest climax community, the seed gathering and disseminating practices of California Indians compose a present that only appears unchanging, stable, or singular, a threading together of a series of successive prolongations of transient meadows. The figure of an illusory inertia, or precarious durability, composed of relatively small or short-lived extensions, whose shortness means they must be constantly renewed, is the link to my next example, drawn from an entirely different context. And this is Anupam Mishra's explanation of how for hundreds of years, traditional water collecting methods in the arid Indian state of Rajasthan were able to make the water from the annual meager rainfall last from one season to the next, sustaining significant populations without irrigation or dependence on water importation from other regions. Mishra explains how Kuin's little household wells, neither deep nor wide, which only reach to the area where water gets trapped between benches of gypsum and surface sand, make again rain that has already fallen. So this passage is on your handout. A well is made to capture groundwater, but a queen doesn't collect water exactly in this way. It collects rainwater in a very special way, even when there isn't any rain. For what is found in the queen is neither water that runs on the surface nor the stagnant, dormant water below ground. It's a complicated affair that derives from the neti, the neither nor of Sanskrit, that allows the cosmic principle in the Upanishads, for example, to be described by negation. The miracle occurs thanks to the relative shallowness and narrowness of the queen, as drops of water sweat or seep out very slowly from the humidity lodged in the sand. They would evaporate if the opening were any wider. Where gypsum is present to prevent rainfall from mixing with the brackish groundwater below, all the drops that fall amass themselves in the sand and change into humidity. If a queen is built there, its stomach, the empty cavity, retransforms this accumulated and humidity into drops. That's Mishra's account. He attends to the specificity of linguistic terms used to capture the distinctness of this capillary water, that neither rainwater nor groundwater lives in the sand. It is, quote, measured not in inches or centimeters, but in rejo, a term that signifies fragment, and reja doesn't measure rain that has fallen on the earth's surface, but rain that has accumulated underneath its surface. And I want you to pause over this term accumulation. I want to take it back from capitalism, or just for that moment. The salient detail for me is that in one day, a queen is barely able to collect enough water to fill 2 or 3 pitchers of 20 liters. There may be enough, but there's no surplus, nothing left over to lay away as security or trade as capital. We have here then a form of moment-to-moment or hand-to-mouth storage and unreservable accumulation, a method of protracting the otherwise fallen, ephemeral, and passing that remains antithetical to the logic of stored energy awaiting use of petrocapitalism, from whose viewpoint the system appears extremely poor and precarious because on any given day there is only enough water to get through to the next. So Mishra in his book describes all the ways in which in the 20th century in these regions the Indian government tried to bring in more modern forms of water piping, and none of them withstood the test of time in the way that these much smaller wells had. Sorry, I shouldn't have broken that. Now I can't find my place. What Mishra calls the system of relays and radical decentralization of the work of water, by which is disseminated among everyone the responsibility of every drop, is temporal as well as spatial. Here, as with the forms of capturing wind and water energy analyzed by Malm, to use is to spend more or less everything as you go and as it passes. Because only time does the work of making something available, there is no illusion, as with coal or its successors, of abundance in the present or richness out of time. The phrase brings me back to Dana Luciano's quip about the Anthropocene as a time out of time, and to the provocation with which I began this essay, the thought that in the midst of the extreme climate instability unleashed by fossil capitalism's extraction and commodification of past stores of solar energy, the cycles associated with the moon as it journeys around the Earth and with the Earth through the constellations have remained relatively stable. Malm's correction and revision of Wrigley's claim that, quote, the virtue of coal was to detach energy needs from present photosynthesis helps me with the transition to my final example. The overlap in figurative and conceptual terms, collection, concentration, captivation, between Mishra's discussion of traditional water collecting methods and Malm's account of wind and water prior to the development of coal-based capitalism, as, quote, sources of energy originating in the sun that flowed through the biosphere uncaptured by photosynthesis, accessible for direct collection and concentration by prime movers designed for the purpose, may serve as a salutary reminder that the problem is not with collection or storage per se, reminding us that what coal replaced was not in the first place a land-based energy economy constrained by the limits of present photosynthesis. Malm also helps sharpen the irony that the so-called release from the near present and accessing of the deep past should have resulted in the kind of entrapment in permanent immediacy critiqued by Prairie, and in a realism that consists of taking precautions to ensure that everything would be potentially accessible at all times. In rejecting Wrigley's Ricardian Malthusian account of the advent of coal as a chance to break free of the bounds of the organic economy and leap into continuous growth, Malm at one point quips that the watermills that preceded coal as Britain's primary source of energy were not plants requiring to be fed more sun than was available in any given year. An image that inadvertently brings out the oddity of conventional agriculture and the violence necessary to its annual forcing of the reproductive parts of grain crops, perpetually delaying the onset of other vegetation while harvesting plants at the point of reproductive maturity, freezing the possibility of reproduction while pressing pause on the cycle before it can occur. The cultivation of annual grain crops would seem, from one point of view, only to intensify, accelerate, and replicate at a much larger scale the distension of ecological time of California Indian gardening practices. So at what point does this difference in degree become a difference in kind? In Ungiving Time, I suggest Wrigley's historical argument about a shift from dependence on and movement with organic energy cycles to a more perpendicular inorganic energy extraction could easily be relativized by remembering that agriculture is often also credited with instituting a shift from living within the constraints of the moment to tapping into deep time. But rather than lay blame for the Anthropocene at the feet of agriculture, as if within it there were only one way of extending and storing and otherwise passing solar energy, these disparate examples suggest the need to examine different modalities and temporalities of collection and release, some of which are more susceptible to the captivation of surplus as marketable reserves necessary for speculative capitalism. I began by noting the degree to which Anthropocene discourse focuses on humanity's power to expand and compress, accelerate or distort circadian rhythms in terms of the sun and solar years, and I also began by claiming in jest that primate menstruation already anticipates the logic of 24/7. So here, by way of conclusion, I would like to turn to the other more shadowy, secondary, but no less structuring or governing measure of time, the moon. I hope readers will forgive me for what will doubtless feel like another leap across centuries and cultural contexts, and that I'm also going to assume some familiarity with practices of planting and harvesting according to the moon's different cycles, many of these practices now go by the name of biodynamic farming. This is, risky territory, but here we go. One ironic measure of the specific untimeliness of the Anthropocene, specific because there are, of course, other kinds of seasonality and ways of being out of sync with planetary movements. One measure of this untimeliness would be the early 21st reception of Sappho's fragment 168b, a poem that relies on its reader's or auditor's ability to tell time by the position of the moon and the stars. This poem is in the Greek on your handout, and I'm using Anne Carson's translation. Moon has set, and Pleiades, middle night, the hour goes by, alone I lie. I don't really want to rehearse this, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but in 2016 there was a scientific paper published by two astronomers at the University of Texas claiming that they had been able to date Sappho's poem based on measurements. They were making the mistake of assuming that the poem was composed at the same time that that the time of the poem is the time of its composition. The paper has since been retracted, but it brought a lot of attention to this poem, and it was all about it was a moment of a kind of discussion between the sciences and humanities, and it met people who were both very excited. Oh my gosh, we can learn something about astronomy by reading Sappho. Were quickly put in their place if they had just been reading Cornelius Castoriadis, who was writing at the end of the 20th century and who'd already figured out what these astronomers were trying to figure out. And so I'm going to talk about him instead, or his reading instead. Castoriadis castigates the contemporary reader, who remains oblivious, he claims, to all of the information that these 4 short lines impart. This is a gift that they make without giving away that they are doing so. So, Castoriadis explains to us It's the middle of the night and the moon has already set. A contemporary reader doesn't understand what this can mean. He doesn't realize that since the moon has set before midnight, we are in between the new moon and the first quarter. I think I knew about that. People would know this, right? If you're seeing the moon before midnight. No? Okay. Well, that's relatively easy. But harder is the question of the Pleiades. In any case, it's the beginning of the lunar month. But the Pleiades have also set. We are in spring. For it's in the spring, even early spring, that the Pleiades have set before midnight. The more the year advances, the later they set. Sappho has set, and the aura passes. That's all Castoriadis. And he goes on to explain to readers, apparently as illiterate in Greek as they are in basic astronomy, that aura in Greek also means season, also hour in the habitual sense, not of clock time, but of the hour as a subdivision of the duration of a day. But aura is also the moment where something is at its hour, where it's really good and beautiful, the acme of youth for humans. In the banquet, when Alcibiades tells how he tried to sleep with Socrates, but got up in the morning having been no more molested than if he'd slept with his brother or father, he concludes, Socrates is a hybristes, someone who insults others. He has so poorly valued my aura, he has disdained my youth, my beauty, the fact that I was ripe to pluck like a beautiful erotic fruit. That's all Castoriadis. The comparison beautifully, if ironically, brings out the latent eroticism of Sappho's fragment, for unlike Alcibiades, Sappho does not complain. The last line might imply complaint towards an awaited lover, it is by now clear isn't coming, but the alone could just as well be relative to the celestial bodies with whom she has kept company and whom she will soon follow in sequence, if she has not already. At least this is how Castoriadis' precise wording, the aura passes and Sappho has set, interprets the verb gativo, which means lie with, or lie down, or sleep. Remembering the utopian senses with which Crary invests the ability to sleep, to surrender, to give in to rest, it is impossible to say whether the ego of the poem lies awake while the rest of the world takes its course, or has met its right end. For the sense of ripe overfullness or erotic readiness makes one indolent and hence susceptible to the hubristes of letting the hour pass and squandering it alone. Castoriadis' gloss on the Greek is helpful here again. Deduca, from the verb duo, means has plunged, has dived. In Greece, land of two inhabited islands with tens of thousands of kilometers of coastlines, the sun, the moon, and the stars don't set. They dive, or plunge. The gap between active, once and for all, irreversible commitment of plunge and the ongoing steadiness or patience of lie, here alone I lie, leaves open the question of whether she is still waiting or also passing. In any case, according to Castoriadis and according to the controversy the poem awoke in 2016, it would now seem to be that it's the poem who now lies alone, bereft of readers capable of reading it. Yet if we're not in time for the poem, if the moment of its easy legibility has passed, the moment when it could count on its recipient to know it was about setting early or not, as the moon does in its spring, and as the Pleiades do in the spring of the year, if we take it as being about a fundamental mismatch between the time of human desire and cosmic time, then in another sense this means the poem's time has finally come, because we're not in time for it. A time ripe for its missing as it rises up to us from the sea of drowned knowledges, spelling out the memory of a lost literacy, and making legible an inintention so gross the celestial bodies might as well have definitively set without return. In turning to Sappho for the question of relatively stable lunar influence, the fragment I had really wanted to talk about was not this one, but the more famous fragment 96 that begins with Sappho imagining the absent friend and perhaps former lover, now in Sardis, turning her thoughts back across the sea to where Sappho and Apis remain. This is the fragment that begins, Sardis, often turning her thoughts here in this direction. The fragment is famous for the Homeric simile comparing the unnamed woman to the rosy-fingered moon, as she evenly distributes her light across salt sea and sweet meadow, as if drawing the salt from the sea to draw flowers out of the earth. And again, this is Carson's translation. But now she is conspicuous among Lydian women, as sometimes at sunset the rosy-fingered moon surpasses all the stars, and her light stretches over salt sea equally and flower-deep fields, and the beautiful dew is poured out, and roses bloom, and frail chervil and flowering sweet clover. Commenting these lines, and this passage is also on your handout, and I am going to close up very quickly now. Page Dubois writes, I earlier argued that it seems to represent a celebration of the unplowed earth, the terrain spontaneously yielding up flowers rather than the life-sustaining grains of cultivated fields. In contrast to discourses that honor the earth as lit up by Homer's rosy-fingered dawn, that make an analogy between the plowed furrows in the earth and women's bodies, and that see agriculture as a crucial and sustaining practice of life in the ancient city, Sappho seems to privilege the female moon and feminine dew and the flowers that bloom at night. But in reassigning the epithet rosy-fingered from dawn to the moon, Sappho doesn't just transpose day to night, borrowing from Homer as the moon does the sun, to convert and transmute a solar energy into a lunar one. She also retains the sense of spring-like earliness and renewal. For a moon that would be visible at sunset would be a relatively new, waxing, and in this sense dawning moon. In this sense, the feminine shadowy penumbra is not just, as Du Bois suggests, an alternative to the sun-driven world of masculine extraction of female energies, but a repetition and embedding within it of the sun's cycles of growth, except at a smaller scale and in pluralized form. Du Bois herself goes on to cite Anne Burnett, who reminds us, according to ancient belief, it was the moon that brought plants to their perfection, and it was by moonlight that flowers were gathered for the beneficent magic and for medicines. Here we have medicines. We have the healing power of herbs that are best gathered by the light of the moon. This ancient belief, cited by Burnett and Delate, concurs with the present practice of those who sow and harvest different kinds of crop according to the lunar phases, because these gardeners take seriously the idea, already partially expressed in Sappho's lines about the evenness of the moon's influence on earth and sea. They take seriously the idea that the moon exerts an influence on earthly grasses that might be comparable to the one that we recognize in the tides. And now I'm in deep trouble because I don't know anything. I never took a class in astronomy, and the moon cycles are very complicated. And the one that matters most is not it's not the waxing and waning with which we're all familiar, right? But the one that people are paying attention to is the ascending and descending cycle, which takes place in 27 days. Not 29. So it's really interesting from a poetic or musical point of view because you have overlapping cycles that are not quite in synchronic relation with each other. And this is where rhythm becomes really interesting, right? It's not just the repetition of a pattern, but the repetition of a pattern in relationship to another pattern. So the ascending and descending is because the moon, as it rotates around the Earth, it does so at an angle with respect to the ecliptic of the Earth's rotation around the sun. So it's kind of looping, right? Like that. And it's something that you can observe, but you can only observe it over time. So if you look for the moon one evening, if it's an ascending moon, it will be higher at that same time the following evening. And it means that just as the sun is doing this, right, the arc of the sun is changing seasonally with winter and summer and is tracing a much longer arc in summer than it is in winter, the moon is tracing sometimes a much longer arc as it's ascending, and this, right? So there's more time with the moon, just as, right, this explains the warmth of the summer is because of the longer arc. We could again think of this, the basis of this seasonality. And Maria Thun is one of the farmers in England who noticed that really plants responded very differently if she was planting in relationship to what the moon was doing in its ascending and descending cycles. And yeah, okay, if I can just give. Okay, so remember in Sappho's lines, or in the commentary on Sappho's lines, we have the idea that flowers were gathered under moonlight because their healing properties were somehow stronger then. While some contemporary gardening, I'll just skip because I've also gone over this. What's exciting to me here is the ability to trace a genealogy of attention to such responsiveness to what the moon might be doing to the grasses and to the healing properties of the herbs back to Sappho, rather than to have to see in biodynamic farming practices only a reactionary expression to earlier 20th century methods of industrial farming. In my wanderings as a woofer, I've met small farmers who practice farming according to the lunar calendar, not from scientific conviction per se, but simply as a way of organizing an otherwise unmanageable number of tasks, each unto the day or night, as it were. Such farming does not want to colonize the night, as Du Bois claims conventional agriculture does the day, but wants, from convenience, and perhaps also from principle, to make itself pastoral, to work in relation to already ongoing cycles, to avail itself of the powers of dormancy, and to let otherwise independent temporal processes do a lot of work or lend a shaping hand. Over against the catastrophic tenor of so much Anthropocene discourse that in the manner of settler colonialism rushes to declare everything over so as to make a tabula rasa for development, I think it behoves us to remember, along with the moon, the kind of ongoing knowledge practices of extension, protraction, collection, and diversification discussed in this talk. Thank you.
So at this point, we'll welcome some questions.
And yeah, I feel like there's 3 papers in one here, so yes.
When in your life and how did you start to learn about Sappho? I know nothing about her other than the mention in the song. Now,
Very late. And in fact, I need to catch up.
And do you know Greek as well?
I'm trying to teach myself, yes. But one of the things I'd obviously like to do is talk to someone, a classicist, who can walk me through the metrical dimensions of these lines.
More than me.
Even without knowing the specifics of the Greek meter, it's just an invitation for you to talk more about meter, poetic rhythm, and even just not the meter within the line, but the fact of lineation. I mean, what distinguishes, and you've been talking about alternative rhythms and alternative forms of cycles. And what distinguishes poetry from prose is that sort of the lines going to the natural end of the page.
Right.
You can call that natural, maybe that's artificial. They have a rhythm and they introduce their own alternative rhythm. And so it strikes me as a clear analogy. It makes sense that you would end with poetry. Would say beginning of the talk, and I just wonder if you have more to say about poetic cycles.
Well, this is the thing I always come back to, and it's very basic, but I do think it's also it's the magic of the poetic line is the turn, right? It's the way that the lineation introduces turning into the verbal material, so that the end of the line is the beginning of the next line, right? Or is in that it produces the uncertainty which I think we have with the seasons. Is something closing, or are we right turning to something else? If we think of seasons as really not autonomously existing things, but they're relative to one another. So yes, in the back of my thinking is always the punning on the furrow and the line is the harvest of the seed, the beginning of something now new, or is it the end of the work of that time? And it seems like poetry opens that or plays upon that in very interesting ways, and again also introduces the possibility of the uncertain pause that need not be a pause, that could be almost skipped over.
I have a totally other question that you can just ignore, but I was wondering about sound, and I mean, obviously there's a relation between meter and sound, but I was also thinking about, do you incorporate or do you attend to any of the thoughts about sound in relationship to the production of cycles and rhythms, sometimes related to the rising of the sun and things like that, you know?
Well,
Or is that getting
yes,
out there?
no, it's actually, I mean, there's, I think all of these, the sensory cues that
Yeah.
involve both vision and sound and touch and smell are all about what the weather might be doing, right? At some point, I was once 2 years ago when I was in Exeter in the UK and using the trains a lot, I met a woman who told me she'd given up her car and she was getting around everywhere by bicycle. And of course, this is in the southwest of England where it rains all the time. So we made a joke about how do you time your little trips on your bike? And she said, I listen to the sound of the birds because I know when it's coming. I can tell by what they're doing. They're my barometer. So, I mean, again, this is a kind of allegorical answer to your question, but it does seem like attending to, if the moon is the site of a diminished site and of a place where you can no longer rely upon the ordinary ways of determining X, then it's important to remember that there are all these other modes of knowing where you are in space and time.
And I also just remember this the summer eclipse that the animals become
Right.
silent. It's really weird little punctuation marks of obviously earthquakes because of different series of reasons, but
Or even, the crickets, you only hear
Right.
crickets at a certain temperature. I again met someone else in France saying, it's above some Celsius degree. Over 25, you'll know if the cricket, if they're audible. And they get louder, of course, the hotter it gets. They persist in Berkeley into November. Anyway.
Thank you so much for the detail on the two cycles of the moon that don't quite fit together. I think in music that one with rhythm played out against another would be called a Humiola effect, so maybe this would be fun for you to explore. Throughout your talk, I was wondering, in the back of my mind was the question, how does looking at all these historical microclimates for these very different contexts relate to our moment when we're in this globalized environment where it's sort of catastrophic ending of seasons, things like that.
Right.
And I wondered about the figure of paradox, which seemed to come up in several of your examples. There's water being extracted from sand, there's the imagery of the dawn being used to describe the moon, and this is very striking to me. What do you see as being the potential as a way of reconciling these two very different forms of cyclicality?
Well, that's great, that analogy. But right, that there's, it's the presence of day within its supposed opposite, or the presence of water within sand. And Mishra begins this book by saying that everyone in Rajasthan remembers that it was once ocean. It's a very arid desert-like region, but there's a memory of the water that was once there. I think there's a there's a potential critique for the ways in which I'm jumping around, right? Which is very much indicative of precisely the globalized, homogenized world where everything is superficially available in mediated form without meeting the classical Greek or so there is a way in which the paper is embodying the very logic it's also trying to critique. But I don't know. I'm partly interested in again in also the persistence of vernacular non-expert forms of knowledge that do know a lot more than is sometimes credited.
I heard once of harvesting water from the air by putting up a piece of fabric.
Yes,
I don't know, in some place, I forget where, but did you ever see one of these QNs? No?
No, but in the same
And where are they located?
well, in households in Rajasthan.
Where is Rajasthan?
It's a province of India. But in the same workshop where I met from Mishra, there were two other people who were working on fog collecting.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I think this may be following our question a little bit, although I may have been similar context. But I wanted to ask you about connecting these questions of temporality to locality and asking if there are ways in which these cycles vary with locality, specifically in relation to fundamentalism, which,
Right.
because you began thinking about the limitations to this, sometimes I wonder if there's a way to think about communities as an attempt to export
Yes.
those actually localized forms of knowledge. This is what that might be fruitful for thinking about issues relations.
Can you to export forms of knowledge that are not
So they're not
place specific?
they're not offered
Right.
to the place where they're being exported to.
Right.
So that then right now there's a standardization and like the capacity as an effort at standardizing and remembering that's sort of
Well, I mean, yeah, absolutely. That the reason that a term like the plantation-ocene makes sense has to do with the ways in which the settling of the Americas coincides with the development of a kind of technology that can dispense with paying attention to differences in locale. I mean, right, that's a paraphrase of the critique of industrial agriculture, is that it brings in from outside the energies needed by the soil. So it can afford to be indifferent. It makes it possible to bring soy to Western Virginia, even though it's not a flat place. All those contradictions have been well. But I don't know if your question is also thinking about how do we then. Again, I think we both in Arden's question too. There's this question of what politically can be done to recognize and bring forward and the persistence of these other practices without necessarily participating in a kind of romanticization of the pre-colonial.
This is a half-formulated question, but it was spurred by your discussion of menstruation. which on the one hand is, an alternative form of seasonality and time that is very personal to that particular female primate. But then, presumably this is true of all primates, that menstrual cycles within a community start to align after a certain time. And so I was just thinking about how the various practices that you were describing are on the one hand defined by being singular and away from, differentiated from the sort of more obvious communal forms of time. Time is not communal, then what is it?
Right.
And then on the other hand, also represent sort of, we call them like microclimates, right? Little micro practices that are communal, but micro. So it's somewhere in between the personal and the public or universal.
Right.
So maybe I'm just paraphrasing what you're saying, and I'm just articulating it again. But it just struck me as an odd position in between the singular and the
Because it is, right, because no, I mean, and this piggybacks on the previous two questions, because there too, everything is done in post-feminist North American industrial, right? We minimize menstruation, right? We pretend every product available to pretend it's not happening. And actually, I've always been kind of obsessed with forms of birth control that like Norplant, that just or forms of pill that now will make it right. You don't need to have it happen unless you want it to happen. So anyways, it's symptomatic of this identification of freedom from being constrained to not do X, right? They're all the time this homogeneous. And during, I don't know if you were following what was happening Standing Rock last year, there were many kind of accounts on the part of white Anglo women who'd gone and who found themselves uncomfortable by the fact that they were being asked at certain points to not be present because it was their special time. And it, like, in some ways this feels so like, why be separated? But I think your question is also speaking to it's a communal form of separation. And now I'm sorry, I've made everyone uncomfortable with volume of things no one is supposed to talk about. And I should, now I might as well throw myself out there that partly you think about this when you hit menopause and you think, oh my God, lost the relationship to the moon I never had. Because I was always taught to not pay attention to it. No one, right? Like, what I was taught was ways to not have to think about it.
About the kind of, so I hear Benjamin and the legibility and times of legibility and legibility of common fears kind of floating through. And then so the kind of philosophy of history or argument, and I'm wondering about that underlying current, and if you could say, your whole paper is an argument for, in some ways, a different philosophy of history, if you want to call it that.
Right.
Is it even a philosophy?
Right.
How much do you want to push it in that? Because you want to think of the wisdom of certain practices, the kind of collective. So there is a kind of, going in the Greek sense of, a kind of practice that's also being invoked. Although you also categorize it as a footnote, so I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, it's Benjaminian in the emphasis on the identification of reading with, again, the ability to receive the messages, to read the material world is in fact full of messages that it wants to impart, and that are not hidden in the same way that there is absolutely nothing obscure about Sappho's poem. But it could easily, in its elliptical, or in its what seems to be its fragmentary, it seems to have delivered nothing, and yet it's that the opacity has to do with a kind of learned blindness.
You began the talk by setting up a contrast between the trace and the inscription.
Right.
And
Right.
the trace seems to be connected with these short-term versions of cycles. And you mentioned the wind, but you could think about other short-term cycles. And I wondered if you relate the inscription to long-term, deep geological times, or the opposite of the short cycles that you've been talking about, and what that would change for your argument.
Wait, what would it would change?
Well, if going beyond the duration of the season, if you look at sort of deep historical time in terms of geology and changes to the earth wrought in this more inscribed way, does that change anything about how you consider cyclicality?
Well, again, I mean, yeah, the easy answer would be to remind, right, or to quote again, or to insist that the first thing we need to do is not to think that there was once a time in which we knew where we were because the seasons were more or less stable, but then because there was all of the things have been slowing down in very tiny ways, and the weather has been right as people this discourse has in some ways been appropriated by climate deniers, but the change has been constant. And so I think if you went down that route, you would then have to start destabilizing the distinction between the inscription and the trace, because even the geological periods would have been defined by a sense of their own fugitiveness or infidelity to what they once were. And again, the question always seems to come back to the speed of disappearance and the speed of with which deep time has been smoked, as it were, by industrial agriculture. But yeah.
Can I ask a question about your emotional relationship to the material that you're reading and presenting? I'm really trying to ask it simply. The persistence of these alternate modalities of collection and release, the persistence of these other practices and other rhythms seems to provide a cause for some kind of hope, or at least to push back against our tendency to see everything as a catastrophe.
Right.
But at different points in the talk, it seems like the reality that these are not our ways, these are not our rhythms. The reluctance to appropriate these other practices from other times and places pushes back against that, or maybe mitigates that hopefulness. So things persist, but they're not my things, or not our things, depending on
Yeah.
the first person.
Yeah.
I guess I wonder which one dominates for you.
No, I would hope actually the first one, because it's like, again, there is a modality of a gift that won't be one unless you avail yourself of it. And I was tempted to use this before. This is from Ray Tirado. I'm going to steal her words for a minute, but this was partly in response to the political question. And Ray has embarked on this extraordinary project of documenting micro differences among wildflowers in California, right? So it's absolutely true what Kat Anderson is saying, that from county to county, you will find not very different, but micro differences that are minute between different flowers, such that, and this is, I think, a weird, and again, it's a parable, it's an allegory, but how could we, I don't know how we could use it politically, but in California wildflower books, you get claims that the generalist, or the common flower is less common than the region or county specific. And so Ray, this is Ray. If the first part of settler colonial thinking clears away inhabitants because they are there, the second part involves claiming that there's nothing left. I often feel I should be taking more photos of dead trees, and I hope someone is. Yet also the forest belongs to the shrubs and flowers now, and they really know what they're doing. They're pushing drought tolerance to new levels. They're enough to hold the earth on the block and condition the soil, and everything that can be done about the forest and whatever it can become in future is being done by them, if they're left alone to do it. Compared with that, the articles underlining the devastation are settler colonialism phase 2 rhetoric, preparing the case for brush clearing in the name of human fire safety, therefore more erosion and more fire actually, and the finishing off that makes way for commercial development. So I'm just struck by this image of the flowers holding the earth in place in drought-stricken California, who are also, again, speaking of, have changed the look of their vegetation, the way they hold themselves in order to retain water. So you can kind of, again, it's legible.
But it's vicarious.
Well, yeah, so it's,
We have to leave them alone.
I think we have to, yeah, but we have, in the sense of not, this is actually, yeah, but this is, again, concrete, because someone else has been working on fire policy, which, as we know, has been terrible, historically absolutely terrible, in terms of letting underbrush develop and not setting smaller fires so that the fires are not catastrophic. But even now with so-called enlightened fire policy, the first thing that happens is that you go and they apparently clear out all the seemingly dead trees, and yet the forest ecologists who know what they're seeing have noticed that a tree that seems dead will actually be putting forth the next spring. So you're, again, because you have this kind of arbitrary sense of when something is over, which coming back to the question of when is the line over, I think poets are more hesitant about making that claim. The sense that, okay, now it's done, we clear it out. We replant, and what's happening is they're replanting with fast-growing trees because they're thinking, oh, the trees are good for us because we need to reduce, they're good, they absorb carbon. And so it's our response to climate change is to plant as quickly as possible. It's important actually to leave the fire area as is so that the trees can, the flowers that require the fire to be pollinated can come in as well as others. A lot is still happening even when it looks finished. And I do think that that's also true of case of community organizing and other human driven struggles.
So I'm not sure if this is a question or not, but it's very responsible. So I was in a talk a couple nights ago about marine was talking about how primates, not only do they share menstruation, but what distinguishes is primates. They're also the ability to remember. Apparently, baboons remember everything. And we also say elephants remember, but baboons apparently really do carry grudges for their entire lives, kind of thing. And apparently some of these other ones do. And so the difference that somehow, I'm not sure if it is a link, but is, I guess an argument can be made, is that as human beings become less dependent upon the natural rhythms of menstruation, or I mean how everything interferes with those kinds of cycles, that the other thing that they tend to do is not to remember. There's a kind of forgetting that comes with the territory now, right? So you could forget climate change or deny it or Holocaust denying or something like that. So I guess I'm trying to figure out if there's something about, I mean, how you would respond to that or something. If there's something about moving away from not attending to what's out there in terms of lunar cycles and things like that, right? That also causes a kind of forgetting that to our detriment.
Right, well, yeah, it's partly, of course, the instruments or the tools that are doing the work of remembering now are not necessarily located within the human brain.
Right, I mean, I think that part of
And-
it is that
right.
there's a distraction about the thing, but also that
No, but there's also, because there's a tremendous capacity to store information that exceed, that is, right.
But I think it was also the, I mean, there was sort of the idea about, part of it about forgetting also has this, positive feelings
Yes,
of
exactly,
forgiving,
exactly,
right? I mean, this idea
exactly.
like, okay, well,
I
I
know.
used to fight, I used to hate you, but now
Yeah.
we're at peace. And,
Yeah,
that
I
kind
can
of
put this down.
right. But there's something gone very askew about
Right.
that.
Right. No, I mean, it would be really interesting to think about this claim about primates not letting go of a grudge in relationship to Weber's account of death and the Nietzsche's account of the human as the ability to make a promise and therefore indebtedness, right? So, and yeah, this is why people like Bernard Stiegler and others who are thinking about the really interesting, the kooky stuff that's happening when memory becomes, it's not that we lose memory, it's just that we're no longer, it's elsewhere.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah. And also maybe like the atrophying of muscle memory
Right.
too, right?
Right.
If you're offshore.
Thinking about time, we have reached our time. So please join us if you can next Monday for a talk by Celine Figoletto on operatic hypnosis in the 19th century, which we can do here at 6 p.m. and on Monday in this space. And please thank me and join me in thanking Andreas Malm.